There is no doubt that you have heard of the famous luxury watch brand Rolex. As one of the most well-known companies on the planet, Rolex is famous for its extravagant and perfectly made watches. But what many people don't know is how this incredible brand was founded. So let's find out all about the orphan boy who created Rolex. Hans Wilsdorf, the eventual creator of Rolex, was born in 1881 in Kulmbach, Germany. Hans was born into a middle-class family of fortunate ironmongers, but his adolescence wasn't easy. In fact, his mother died when he was only 2 years old, and only 10 years later, his father passed on as well. Although Hans was technically an orphan, his wealthy uncles who sold the iron business ensured that he and his sisters were educated at the finest boarding schools. Young Wilsdorf's life was not full of love and affection from his parents, and although he was financially supported by his uncles, he felt lonely and lost at boarding school. However, he later said that he greatly appreciated his education, in which he excelled in math and languages. These skill sets proved invaluable when he began to travel abroad and create his soon-to-be empire. After school, he moved to Geneva, Switzerland. He quickly got a job as an intern at a pearl exporting company. And while there, he learned quite a bit about the world of business, including how to make money without actually manufacturing anything. However, it wasn't until 1900 that he found his true passion, watchmaking. At only 19 years old, he moved to La Chaux-de-Fonds and began working at a watchmaking company, Cugnot-Cortin. He was offered the job by a friend from school, and quickly took the opportunity to move to this idyllic town and work for the important company. Although he got the job because he could speak fluent English and help with correspondence in the UK and USA, his job also included winding hundreds of watches every day, which sparked his curiosity about the inner workings of the magical machines. After his short military service in Germany, he moved to London and got yet another job at a watchmaking company. But he decided to strike out on his own only 2 years later with his brother-in-law and opened their watchmaking shop, Wilsdorf and Davis. Young Wilsdorf did not make the watches himself, but instead outsourced the designs he created to be manufactured in Switzerland by watchmaker Hermann Egler. While Hans certainly had the skill set to create beautiful and popular watches, he was not pleased with the chunky and inconvenient pocket watches of the time. So he decided to create something that was not currently available: the perfect wristwatch for men. In 1905, wristwatches were not very popular. Most men preferred the pocket watch, as wristwatches were seen as accessories for women. Another issue with contemporary wristwatches was that they were smaller and more often inaccurate. Because the instruments inside were so small, they often malfunctioned, making the watch run faster or slower, which meant that they were both untrustworthy as well as feminine. However, Hans believed in the wristwatch and set to producing a well-made, masculine, and perfectly functioning model. In fact, Hans is quoted in 1916 as saying, "My personal opinion is that pocket watches will almost completely disappear and that wristwatches will replace them definitely." But long before he made his all-knowing statement, Hans was incredibly focused on his goal and traveled around the continent discussing tactics with other watchmakers to make his dream of an accurate wristwatch a reality. His company did extremely well, and within 10 years of their start, Wilsdorf and Davis was a well-known name in the watch industry. While building his business, Hans was aware that the name they originally chose, Wilsdorf and Davis, simply would not do. He wanted a name that was short and would fit within the face of the timepiece, as well as catchy, easy to say, and elegant. Therefore, he began testing out various names by simply mixing various letters of the alphabet together to see what they formed. Thus, Rolex was born. And while the word didn't mean anything at the time, it would eventually become synonymous with luxury wristwatches. Although the young watchmaker copyrighted the name Rolex, he didn't actually start using it for some time. The company was still known as Wilsdorf and Davis and was doing incredibly well. Throughout the following years, men around London and Europe began purchasing Hans wristwatches. Even the elite were jumping on board, propelling the watches into high fashion and increasing Hans' personal success. In fact, the company didn't even need to shut down during World War I. His perfectly accurate wristwatches were actually bought by the government and distributed to soldiers. As Hans always said, they were convenient and easier to check than pocket watches. While popularity grew among the masses, Wilsdorf and Davis were also impressing the critics. It won the Wristwatch Chronometer Rating Award from Switzerland and a Class A certificate from London. Wilsdorf's wristwatches were 100% accurate, and everyone knew it. They could finally trust a wristwatch, and because of his immense success, when the British government imposed a 33% tax on all companies that exported goods, Hans simply picked up his business and moved it to Switzerland. Although avoiding this hefty tax was reason enough to move, there was another aspect to it as well. During World War I, the British population began to distrust anyone from Germany, and as Hans so clearly was, he felt it was best to move to a more neutral country. As well, because his last name Wilsdorf was both German and printed on his watches, he finally made the decision to officially change the name of the company to Rolex. While Rolex continued its upward track to success, Hans didn't rest for a minute. He was determined to create not only an accurate wristwatch, but also one that could withstand anything a human wrist encounters, including dust, water, sweat, movement, and so on. And luckily for the world, he did just that. In 1926, he created the Rolex Oyster, the first waterproof wristwatch ever made. Hans decided to save the release of his waterproof watch until the opportune moment, which happened to come 2 years later in 1927. At that time, a young English woman named Mercedes Glietz told the world that she could swim across the English Channel to France. With thousands of people watching to see if you could truly swim the 20.5 miles, Hans asked her to wear the Rolex Oyster during her voyage. After 10 hours, Mercedes didn't make it all the way to France and needed to be saved. However, the watch was still working perfectly. Wilsdorf then capitalized on this publicity and placed an ad discussing the watch's amazing feat. Over the next decade, Hans continued to use the media to promote everything the Rolex Oyster could do, including sending it in a plane above Mount Everest and in a car that drove more than 300 miles per hour. In every instance, the watch still told the correct time to the second. During this time, Rolex was continuously marketing their watches in newspapers, on models, and in fish bowls in their stores. Hans Wilsdorf once said, "Only great marketing is needed to make a company successful," and there is no doubt that his marketing campaign throughout the 1930s was a wild success. Even though the Rolex Oyster was immensely popular, Hans didn't stop there. He also produced the Rolex Oyster Perpetual, which was the first self-winding waterproof watch in the world. However, while this self-winding watch was still not perfect, Hans continued to work to perfect his design. Sadly, because of Hans' German heritage, he still struggled to prove himself to the rest of Europe, especially during World War II. And of course, exports became far more expensive, and Rolex struggled to survive during the years of the war. But luckily for Rolex, immediately after the war, business returned and grew exponentially. By 1947, the company had sold 100,000 watches, with the release of the Rolex Datejust, which not only was self-winding and waterproof, but also gave the date of the month. Rolex had become the most prominent watchmakers in the world. And then 10 years later, they created a watch that also told the day of the week, as well as a watch that could reach 100 meters underwater and still function. Hans passed away in 1960, and while the company continued with its legacy and made some of the best watches in the industry, it decided to change its marketing tactic and promote Rolex as a more luxury brand for the elite, as opposed to a watch for the masses. In fact, the company decided to change the material of the watch to 904L, an incredibly expensive and durable stainless steel. While this drove up the price of Rolex watches, it also made them especially unique and valuable. Interestingly, increasing the price point only seemed to make Rolex more popular. Its elite status made the rich want to buy one, and the poor wish they had one. As they say, the rest is history. Rolex became an absolute must-have across the entire planet, with unbelievably successful advertising, perfect products, and a dedicated team. Rolex continued to gain traction as the best-made wristwatches in the world. Today, Rolex is worth north of $8.35 billion. And interestingly, one reason for Rolex's out-of-this-world financial success is that before he died, Hans sold the company to the Wilsdorf Foundation, a charity he established after his wife passed away. And because Rolex is owned by a charity, it will never be publicly sold and doesn't need to pay taxes on its income. So many people want a Rolex watch that there is now a wait list to get one, and with varying price tags from $6,500 to $75,000. Having one on your wrist is an incredible symbol of status and wealth. While Rolex is now essentially synonymous with the luxury wristwatch, it's important to remember that they are also some of the best-made wristwatches in the world. Hans Wilsdorf dedicated his life to creating implausibly perfect timepieces, and in so many ways, he changed the way the world made and used watches. And although Hans Wilsdorf is no longer alive, his legacy and innovation will live on forever through Rolex watches. Hungry for another fascinating business story? Click on the following video to hear the crazy story about the homeless boy who created Louis Vuitton.